Warning: the following podcast contains graphic content that may be disturbing or triggering to some listeners. Discretion is advised. The Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast is available free of charge thanks to the support of Cracked Armor.
Their mission is to raise awareness for PTSD, TBI, and mental health to support those who struggle. By creating an army of warriors who represent the gear, their hope is that it will send a message to others that they are not alone.
Go to crackedarmor.com, say hi to Mark Long, read about the story, and find some research information about PTSD. And if you can, look good while supporting Cracked Armor by buying some gear.
(10-9). Did you say Papa Tango Sierra Delta? 10-4.
There's so much left to do, so many things I wanna say, and I say, don't make the change. If it rains every single day, I'll fight to blow it all away.
This is episode 22 of the Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast. My name is Larry Payton, and I have been diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress. Just want to take a quick moment to thank everyone who has placed an order for a Papa Tango Sierra Delta challenge coin and or patch. The support has been fantastic and is very much appreciated. It makes me proud to know that people out there are going to be wearing a patch or carrying a coin that says, yeah, I'm struggling with some mental health injuries. I'm okay with it. I'm okay with the fact that I've earned these scars. I love that. This is what we need, is more conversation. We need to normalize mental health injuries so that future generations can have conversations about them without the fears and stigmatization that we have all experienced. We just need to continue talking about it and make it palatable for everyone to understand, to hear, to say. One of the questions that's been asked about the challenge coin is the Nova Scotia flag on the back. And some people have asked if I would be doing other provincial flags on future iterations of the coin. The Nova Scotia flag is not there because it's currently where I'm posted, because it's currently where I live, or where the podcast is recorded. If you notice the flag, it's tattered. It looks like it's taken a bit of a beating, because it has. The flag is there in memory of the mass shooting that happened in April 2020, in memory of all the victims and the families of those victims who still live with that pain, in the memory of Constable Heidi Stevenson, who lost her life trying to protect others, and my brothers and sisters who attended that call and who helped work on the investigation for same. And it's there because ultimately that is what led to my eventual diagnosis. For anyone who wishes to order a challenge coin or a patch, you can send me a direct message and pay by an email money transfer, or you can just go online to my Square webpage using your debit, credit card, whatever. If you want to go via the Square, you can find the link for that page in the show notes for this episode. I also want to just take a moment to read an email I got this week. It's fantastic. Yeah, I love getting messages from listeners and to know that, again, the show is actually doing something for someone and it's helping someone somewhere. It says, Larry, I just listened to episode 20 and it was like a walk down memory lane. I went off 3 times in my 28-year law enforcement career due to a TBI, a life-changing training injury, and a misdiagnosed and a personally ignored CPTSD injury. The 3rd time was strike 3 and I walked away. I now have the space to see the injuries, but what still grinds me the most are the moral injuries and the sanctuary trauma. Thanks for kicking over the rock on this episode by talking about the moral injury, sanctuary trauma, passive suicide thoughts, the stigma, the night terrors, suicide of other members, and all the other crap that comes along with this journey. I have been on an 18-month journey of healing, and listening to podcasts like yours helps a ton. Thanks. Very cool, and I appreciate that message. Thank you very much for reaching out and sharing. As for you out there, I'm going to take a moment to wish you a happy Canada Day. Enjoy it with your friends and family. Try to put a smile on your face. Try to feel a little bit of pride in your heart. And just try, even for an hour, to just let go. To let go of this shit. Give yourself a break. You deserve it. I also, for our listeners south of the border, would like to say Happy Independence Day. So have fun, enjoy the day, and take time for yourself as well. One last thing I'm going to say before the break. It's been a good week. It's been a good week, and I am genuinely appreciative for that. There were some incidents that I encountered this week where I would normally deal with in a very poor manner. This week, I actually managed to step aside, regain my composure, think things through, and then answer in a much more professional manner than I typically would have. And you know, it actually worked out really well because I did that. And in hindsight, if I reacted the way I typically do, yeah, it really would not have worked out well. So I am appreciative for that. I'm going to end off with a quote from U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He says, "In life, there are wolves, sheep, and sheepdogs. Most of the people in our society are sheep. They are kind, gentle, productive creatures who can only hurt one another by accident. Then there are the wolves, and the wolves feed on the sheep without mercy. There are evil men in this world, and they are capable of evil deeds. The moment you forget that, or pretend it is not so, you become a sheep. There is no safety in denial. Then there are sheepdogs. They live to protect the flock and confront the wolf." There's a number of great things in that, but the one thing I really want you to take away is that your PTSD came from your work as a sheepdog. Whether you're in fire, paramedic, nurse, military, corrections, so on and so on and so on. Those are injuries that you received from your work as a sheepdog. It's okay that there are lasting effects of that, because the reality is that you have learned things about life that the sheep really do not know. You have seen evil. You have seen destruction. You have seen despair, pain, sadness, and grieving, and how quickly life can be taken away. You are a sheepdog, and I appreciate what you have done in sacrifice and in service for everyone in the flock. Let's take a quick break.
This episode of the Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast is brought to you thanks to the support and financial sponsorship of Cracked Armor. Go to crackedarmor.com, read the story, buy the gear, wear it, to send a message to others who are struggling that they're not alone.
Also, check out Willow Tree Farm, care of Jason Subkowicz, another member who is struggling with PTSD and who frequently updates his Instagram to share his story. You can follow him at jason.subkowicz. That's jason.Sierra Oscar Bravo Kilo Oscar Whiskey India Charlie Zulu.
We are back from the break. Thank you for sticking around for the Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast. On this episode, we have former paramedic and current amazing artist, which I'm sure you've seen his art before, Daniel Sundahl. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Obviously, we're going to get into your artwork and what led you there. It's amazing artwork. For anyone who hasn't seen it, get on to Dan Sun Photos. You can find him on Instagram, Facebook. It's easy to track down, and I'm confident those who are listening to this podcast have seen Daniel's work before. So, Daniel, please introduce yourself and tell us about your journey.
Yeah, so my name's Daniel Sundahl. I'm actually still officially a registered advanced care paramedic with Alberta College of Paramedics, but I am off CAR. I've been off CAR for just over a year because of a second dose of symptoms from my PTSD. I was first diagnosed with PTSD in 2014, and that's when I started creating the artwork as a form of my therapy. And it was very healing and cathartic for me. But over time, because I was still being exposed to the traumas by being on the ambulance and network, I still started having the symptoms never really went away because the causes were still there. And they started to come back in different ways. The difference this time was that I recognized what was happening. And this time it really started to affect my memory. So I wasn't able to remember protocols. I wasn't able to remember drug dosages. And it started to affect my memory in a lot of different ways. So I went and got reassessed, got retested, and then my psychologist said, no, you're done. You're not working on the ambulance anymore, which wasn't my original plan. My original plan was to retire at 65. I worked for a dual service department, so I was hoping that I would be able to move to the engine and retire on the engine, but that just wasn't my path. But I continued to start doing the artwork. And so I got fixed up. I had a team of mental health professionals that put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And now I'm back in school learning to become a counseling therapist and continuing to create my artwork, exhibit my artwork, and speak on post traumatic growth. Yeah, so I'm very excited. It's a new chapter in my life, and I'm really excited about it.
Your artwork is absolutely fantastic. And again, I encourage everyone to go take a look at Dan Sun Photo Art here on Instagram, or you can track him down in many other places, just so you have an idea of exactly what we're speaking about today. And Daniel, meeting you at the Tema Foundation Education Day, the Mental Health Education Day, your presentation there was fantastic, and you really focused on post-traumatic growth. Please, if you could, speak to what has led you to post-traumatic growth, how it is you got there, what it means, what it feels like, because there's a lot of people who just think that this is a life sentence. There's no such thing as ever leaving this. There's no such thing as living with it. There's no such thing as actually growing from it.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful message, and it's something I wasn't aware of until a psychologist heard me talk about the artwork, and he says, "Hey, Dan, you're experiencing post-traumatic growth." And I'm like, "What did you say? What did you call me?" I kind of like, "What do you mean? What do I have?" Like, I kind of took it as it's like, "What are you talking about?"
Right? Yeah.
And he goes, "No, it's a good thing." So I started researching it, and it's something that's been around for a long time. And the idea is it's when you rise to a higher level of functioning because of the trauma that you experienced and the process to recover. You know, it's very present in modern day culture, especially in like comic book heroes. The post traumatic growth is like the theme of most superheroes. You know, Batman, who witnesses his parents get murdered, and because of that trauma, he now becomes a billionaire crime fighter. You know, Spider Man's the same, Wonder Woman's the same, the Hulk is the same. So all these superhero origin stories are really stories of post traumatic growth.
That's
Now, of
true.
course, those are fictional. However, I travel the world. I'm very lucky that I get to exhibit my work around the world, and I meet thousands of our peers. And I see signs of post traumatic growth in many, many of our peers that have gone through trauma and have recovered and are now better because of that trauma and recovery process. So much so that I have my own conference every year. We're going to have our next one in Canmore this October, where I invite my peers that I've met and I've heard their stories, and they share their experiences of post traumatic growth. And I think it's a really powerful message because, like you said, usually it's, yeah, I have PTSD, I'm struggling, and I'm just trying to get back to where I was, which, of course, I'm not denying that. That's how I was, that's how many people are. But when I heard about this concept of post traumatic growth and how that experience was my experience, I think it's a really powerful message for those that are maybe still really struggling at those initial stages where, you know, these aren't, I'm not a mental health professional, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not teaching people, I'm not telling people what to do. I'm just sharing my experience as a peer as to this is what happened to me. I was lucky that I found a process of recovery for me, and sometimes that's really tough. But going through that, and in the presentation, I use an analogy of a bean or a seed, where the seed has to essentially be destroyed in order for this plant or flower to grow. And I think that's a good analogy for post traumatic growth. And there's a lot of people that are experiencing it, a lot of emergency workers that are doing amazing, wonderful things because of those experiences that they've had. So the message is the potential is not only to get back to where you were, and I believe that's resilience. So how soon you get back to where you were is based on resilience, but the potential is that you can rise above where you were before the trauma. And the science behind it is that you, through therapy and treatment, you're actually building new neural pathways in your brain through the therapy. And so your brain is actually different. And your brain chemistry, again, this is in my case, my brain chemistry was altered so much to the point where my capacity was so diminished that I thought suicide was a reasonable way out. And how I was thinking was, okay, I'm going to kill myself today and then I'll be all right. And the reason I thought that and thinking that it would be okay after I killed myself was because my brain chemistry and neural pathways were off. So through therapy for me, that was all corrected and I built new pathways, which actually changed my perceptions and changed my thought processes. And there's nothing special about me. There's nothing unique about me. And like I said, I've seen many of our peers have gone through that process. It's tough. It's not easy, but the potential is there. And sometimes that message of, okay, the potential is there, other people have done it, then I can do it. And that's what I focus on when I share my story and exhibit my artwork. Well, I hope it's an inspiring story of hope, of recovery, and not only recovery, but rising above, becoming even better because of your experiences, like a superhero.
It's very cool. There's a lot going on there. So I love the analogy with the seed, that it has to be destroyed first. Beautiful.
Yeah, because it's not that easy.
No, it's not. And it's really hard to wrap our minds around because, well, we don't get destroyed per se in terms of our comprehension as a seed does. However, yeah, that's what needs to happen.
So I'm just going to say with the analogy of the seed, the whole seed doesn't get destroyed. It's just the casing around it. And so the casing around it gets broken apart in order for the inside to actually grow. Another analogy is a phoenix, right? Where a fiery phoenix grows out of the ashes or the trauma. So like the seed where it's not the whole seed gets destroyed, it's just the casing around it, or that one, the shell that's keeping the inside from growing and getting bigger. So
Yeah, the shell.
You know what I mean? Just the
Absolutely.
shell.
And even that, the shell, because, ultimately, that's potentially what people who struggle with PTSD should be thinking is, how do I rid myself of this shell? I personally don't believe that you go back to what you were before. I personally believe you remain changed. However, I also personally believe that you can be significantly better than you were before because of the diagnosis, because of your experiences, because of your learning how not only to struggle with it, but how to live with it. And then using that to figure out a way you can grow. In particular, when it comes to you, Daniel, your artwork is cathartic. It has to be. If you could tell people about some art pieces that really mean something to you, that are special, and if you could also explain some of the hidden things that are in the artwork that people don't necessarily see upon first glaze.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I hide in the artwork, not to shock people or, oh, look, that's there. But a lot of the things that I hide are there purposely to portray the complex emotion or feeling that I'm trying to purge from my mind. So the process in creating the artwork is that I have a feeling or an emotion that is from some of the experiences that I've had. And I think about it, and then an image pops into my head of how I'm going to portray that complex idea. Then I stage it with my peers, I photograph it, then I digitally draw and paint on top of that photograph. And what I'm doing in that process is I'm trying to recreate how I feel rather what I saw. And that's when I put certain things in it. So a good example is Finding Peace, which is one of my favorite images. It's the cover of my second book. And when you first look at it, there's a paramedic and an angel. They're face to face, their foreheads are touching. And at first glance, it looks pretty sad, where the paramedic has his head down. He's in uniform, he's got his kits in his hand, and he looks distraught. And then the angel is there, he's a little bit taller, with his hand around his neck. And essentially he's saying, it's okay, I got your back. The real motivation in creating that, if you look really close, in the top right-hand corner of that picture, there's a devil that's screaming. And I use devils and angels to represent trauma and recovery. So his trauma in the top right-hand corner is screaming because he no longer has the grips on that paramedic. So it's a real positive image of recovery for me, and that was the idea of it. And in real life, the people that were in that, he's a real paramedic, is Curtis. He was my neighbor for many, many years, and that's his actual dad.
Wow.
Yeah, they were perfect for that image that I wanted to portray. So that's one of my favorite ones. The other one that I really like that I'm actually going to do a reiteration of, I'm just in the process of that. I actually have a meeting later today about the photo shoot for that one, is Torn. And Torn is this paramedic, and he's on his knees. He has this absolutely indifferent look on his face. Like he has no emotion. He's just empty. And then on one side, there's a devil pulling on his arm, which represents his trauma. And then the other side, there are his peers. There's a firefighter, a paramedic, a police officer, and a nurse. And they're pulling on his arm the opposite direction. So he's lost the capacity to fight for himself, but his peers are there essentially fighting for his life. And suicide's on the other side pulling, whereas he has a look on his face where he doesn't really care which way he goes. He just wants something to happen. And that's a really powerful. I did that one in Las Vegas with some emergency workers that were there, and that was a really amazing photo session as well. But that's another one of my favorite ones. But my most favorite image, and probably the darkest one I've ever created, is called The Demon Eats the Ambulance Driver. And I called it ambulance driver on purpose, and I know that we don't like being called ambulance drivers. But it's an image of a paramedic, and his arms are down. He's not defending himself, and he is being eaten by this giant monster. So this beast has his arms wrapped around the paramedic's body. The paramedic is headless as this monster is devouring him. It's a pretty powerful and disturbing image to look at. But that image represents the act of suicide, where the paramedic or emergency worker has succumbed to their injury, where they aren't defending themselves. They are literally being consumed by their trauma. And that's how I felt, where for suicide, it was just something, okay, I just give in. Like I can no longer handle this constant barrage, this constant pressure, day and night, 24 hours a day for years. It's like I just can't handle it anymore. It's just too much. And I don't want to feel it anymore. So it's this paramedic that has really just succumbed, and he's allowing himself to be consumed by his trauma. It's very powerful. And for those of us that have been that close, it was, for me, the most accurate representation of that feeling and emotion portrayed in a two-dimensional image.
Very, very deep. These paintings are absolutely amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
Daniel, you had mentioned that there's thoughts or memories that come into your mind, and that you then try to purge them by portraying what you've captured. Do you find that doing the artwork can allow you to process some of those memories, some of those thoughts? Do you feel it still lingers after you do some artwork?
When I'm done the artwork, the process is different. And in school, I'm actually learning the neuroscience behind what's happening and why creating the artwork and processing it while using my frontal cortex, how that helps. Because normally you would have the emotion, or you'd have that memory, and then your amygdala automatically, it's called HPA axis, automatically will shoot down the physical response to that memory. And it's supposed to be that way. Our brains are wired that way so that we don't have to think, oh, that bear is coming to attack me. What should I do? Maybe I should run. And then you run. It just happens automatically. So when I create the artwork, I am thinking of that memory, but at the same time, I'm activating other parts of my brain, which is interrupting that process. So I'm able to control that activity and control that process. And it takes a long time to create the artwork. And by doing that, I transfer those emotions and feelings into this two-dimensional picture. And then when I'm done, now I associate that memory with the image that I created, that I controlled. So I don't have the invasive thoughts after, based on that one image or that one concept I'm trying to portray. So for me, it's a way of purging these. I describe it as like an organic monster that invades my consciousness uninvited. The memories just pop into my head. But after I create the artwork, I'm able to harness it, control it, and essentially corral it into this image and trap it in there. And then, yeah, when I'm done, I no longer have those invasive thoughts about that one particular idea.
Absolutely amazing. One of the ones I'm looking at here right now, Daniel, is called The Last Kiss, and the comments you make here are traumatic stress destroys families. Could you
Yes.
speak to that one, please? Just because, well,
Yeah.
and the reason I ask is I recorded with a couple. He is a retired armed forces, and his wife speaks about how much has affected their life and how there was very little, and there still remains very little options, I guess, and even comprehension of how it affects everyone else in the family. So if you could relate to that, please.
Yeah, that's and this is an area that I really want to focus on when I'm done my training, is to really help families, because it really does affect the whole family. And I believe that if I knew what I know now, what I was going through, I probably could have saved my marriage. So I've been divorced. Big part of that was because of my trauma, amongst other things that happened. But I think if I would have understood what was going on as far as perceptions go between me and my wife, I think things would have turned out differently. Now, for me, I was so numb to everything that when I would come home, I had no emotion about anything. And of course, my wife would perceive that as being, well, my husband doesn't love me. Naturally, she would perceive that way. But the truth was, I didn't love anything. I didn't have emotions or feelings for anything. And at the same time, because my fuse was so short, which was a symptom of trauma, I got angry really quickly. I would feel she wasn't supporting me. And I would get really angry about it, which really kind of spiraled everything. So I think if there's a therapist that understands kind of how that process happens and kind of look behind the curtain, reveal what's really happening from all sides, there might be, a better understanding of what's happening and a supportive effort on both ends to really kind of get through it. And, I see that happens to a lot of us. And I think it's really sad. So it's an area that I really want to focus on. But yeah, when we come home, and again, I'm not going to talk on behalf of other people. I can only share my own experiences. However, I don't think my experiences are unique to me. It really does. How can it not affect the people around you and your family? And if you become numb to everything, if you want to become isolated, if you get really angry easily, if you lack the ability to feel joy or happiness anymore, it's bound to affect the people around you. And if they don't understand what's happening, well, then of course their perception is going to be, hey, you're a bit of an asshole, right? That's what, if they don't know what's really
Absolutely.
going on,
Yeah, right.
right? And so, of course, that's really going to affect families. And it did mine. It ended my marriage. So it's an area that I really want to focus on, because I think there are some unique properties for people suffering from trauma in relationships that need to be handled a little bit differently than normal family therapy, in my opinion.
I concur. Absolutely. I concur with you. Daniel, one of your paintings is of a firefighter. And in one side of the painting, he's got his helmet in his hand on his side. The other side of the painting, he's wearing his helmet. There really is no difference between this man other than that he's standing in different poses, but it's the same man. However, above his head, there's two different words. One says cancer, one says PTSD. You get into what is the difference in diagnosis, and obviously, one of those has a significant stigmatization to it. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, you're picking some good images. You're picking ones that people really haven't called me on before. You're keeping me on. You're keeping me on my toes.
That's good.
Yeah, that is good. I should probably mention too. I'm sitting in my living room and I have a 65-pound bulldog that thinks he's a lap dog. So if you hear any like snoring or bangs or anything in the background, it's just my bulldog who's still a puppy. Yes, for that one, I think it's, and probably a good analogy for that too, and I bring this up in my presentation, is for the military men and women who die by suicide. And the last statistic I read is 22 every day. And that's a giant number. Like, that is a giant number. And for some reason, that doesn't seem to be an alarming thing for a lot of people. And I think that has to do with the stigma. And for stigma, it's, people think, well, let's smash the stigma. Just if something happens, come forward and say something. But, it has teeth. If people do that, there is going to be consequences depending on where you work, and the health environment of your workplace is that you could have some serious consequences, up to and including getting fired for coming forward with any issues with mental health based on the calls that you've done. So that particular image with the firefighter is, we have, depending on where you are, there's presumptive legislation for firefighters who died by cancer, which, is it's assumed that it's work-related, which is fantastic. That's going to support families. And it is better, it is coming in some provinces here where there is presumptive legislation where if an emergency worker gets diagnosed with PTSD, it's assumed it's because of their work. And I have some opinions on that too, because even when that happens, many emergency workers are still put through the ringer. In a lot of cases, even though that presumption is in place. However, if a emergency worker dies by suicide who has been diagnosed with PTSD, it's not the same. And God, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to belittle emergency workers that die by cancer. That is not the purpose here.
No, not at all.
Is that it should be equalized. And here's a good example of that. A firefighter here died by suicide not too long ago here in Alberta. And I was on shift the next day. And I did an art piece on this and I shared it on my presentation when I was talking about stigma. The next day I was in the hallways with my patient in the hospitals waiting for a room. And I heard other emergency workers talk about this fellow who died by suicide the day before. And they were saying, how could he do that? How could he take the easy way out? How can he do that to his family? And I'm thinking this poor guy is still being stigmatized even in his death. And in my opinion, he died from his injury. He died from a work-related injury, is what my view of it is.
I agree.
And if that firefighter died in a house fire, people certainly wouldn't be saying that about that. Or if he died by cancer, you'd have a parade. So that mindset and that stigma, I think we have a long way to go there. Where I did another art piece on this topic, and it actually got pulled off of Facebook, where it's a firefighter with a gun to his head, but the devil is actually behind him holding the gun with his finger on the trigger. And the firefighter, it's the paramedic, he's looking distraught that he's not actually doing it himself. His trauma is pulling the trigger. So he's actually dying from his trauma. The message for that art piece was post-traumatic stress isn't something that we catch like the flu. It's something that happens to us like an injury.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that got pulled off of Facebook because they thought it condoned suicide, which was the exact opposite of the message. It was like, well, no, he is dying by suicide technically, but he's not actually. And again, I'm an artist, so I can portray my thoughts how I want. That he isn't actually pulling the trigger. His trauma is pulling the trigger. And that's kind of the idea of that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's my idea. And I think one day we'll get there where I don't want to say normalize because that sounds weird, but to equalize mental injury with physical injury. So in many cases when, I hear backlash about mental health on emergency workers and suicide, I say, well, would you say that same thing about somebody who died from cancer? If a firefighter died because of the toxins they ingested through a career of firefighting and then ended up dying because of that, would you speak negatively about that versus a firefighter who has toxic experiences that have affected his brain chemistry and his neural pathways to the point where he died by suicide? Why would you stigmatize him against that versus it's a very different opinion. And that was kind of the genesis of that one picture of that firefighter. Same guy, looking the same, just in a different pose. Yet one has cancer, one has post-traumatic stress. Yet the external view or the social view of that is much different.
Absolutely, completely different. And I wonder, and I've been wondering for a while, how much that view is actually based upon the realities of other people. Now, I say that in the sense that I believe we try, and it's a natural thing, but we try to distance ourselves mentally, I guess, in terms of any issues that happen to other people. So, if, for example, let's talk about cancer. I get a person who gets cancer, a friend of mine. I start looking at, well, what did he do different than me? Oh, okay, well, he was a smoker, or he's older than me, or he lives an unhealthy life, or whatever. But it becomes this natural way to defend yourself that you're going to be okay. And so I say that and I extrapolate that to mental health. And I can't help but wonder, when we're going to get into talking about toxicity in a second, but I can't help but wonder how much toxicity is actually a result of people who are struggling to deal with their own issues and as such try to distance themselves from it by stigmatizing. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I 100% agree. And often when I'll post an image, sometimes I'll get some really aggressive emails about it. People will message me personally and really rip into me. And I've learned that that is really less to do about the artwork and more of them looking at that image and putting a mirror up to their face and forcing them to look at what their experiences are. And that makes them angry. And I discussed this with my therapist, and he concurs that is likely what's happening.
I believe it too.
Because otherwise, why would they take the time and the effort to send me a long email about how much they didn't like that art piece?
Yeah, you hit a nerve, right? You struck a nerve.
Yeah, struck a nerve with them. So it's less about the artwork and more about the. But I feel bad for those people because that's, it's hard. It's difficult. It's not easy, especially in what environment that you're in. It's not easy to come forward. It's not easy to, like I said, if some people, if they do come forward, there's going to be serious consequences up to and including losing their jobs and their livelihood. And people can't lose their jobs that way. They've got kids, they've got families, they've got a mortgage. It's not that easy to risk that. So I understand that. And yeah, I think the stigmatization is, yeah, it's tough because I don't know. Everybody has their own experiences. People aren't affected the same way. I don't believe that everyone's going to be affected and get post-traumatic stress if you were going to be an emergency worker. Recently, I was in the States and someone came up to say, Dan, I've been a corrections officer for 25 years and I feel totally fine. What's wrong with me? I'm like, hey, there's nothing. It's okay to be okay. But he was worried that there's something wrong with him because he wasn't affected the way other people were. So it's kind of like this weird reverse stigma thing happening. But
yeah, it's coming full circle if that's the case. It's coming full circle.
Yeah, but it is a lot different. But going back to the stigmatization of the injury, often I hear people say, look, if you can't take the job, then get out. But what would happen if, a firefighter was in a house fire, there's a collapse and they broke their leg? You wouldn't say, oh, that firefighter has weak femurs.
Exactly.
You shouldn't be a firefighter because you have weak bones.
Exactly.
Because maybe there's two firefighters that were there. One broke their leg, the other one didn't. You wouldn't say that. But for some reason, people think, they died by suicide because, they just weren't mentally strong enough to hack the job.
You're right.
But you wouldn't say that about someone if you equalize it to the physical injury. And then often using that same example, if a firefighter fell, broke their leg, or died in a house fire, there would be a massive investigation about that. There'd be a workplace fatality. There'd be investigators coming in from, external investigators coming in to see what happened to try to prevent it from happening again. Yet, if a firefighter dies by suicide, it's, thoughts and prayers, and nothing really gets investigated. Now, I understand it's a lot more gray than investigating a house fire, finding causes and any safety protocols that weren't followed. However, there are many control factors that can be in place to prevent emergency worker suicide. And we could learn these by looking into what has happened or led up to emergency worker suicides. Now, this is something that Dr. Olivia Johnson does in the States. She focuses mostly on police officers, but she can do a suicide autopsy, one of the few people in the world that are registered to do that. And so she can investigate a suicide and determine if it's work-related or not.
Wow.
So my understanding after reading her textbook is that she can classify it in 3 different ways. 1, the emergency worker had trauma prior to coming into that workplace that was contributing to them dying by suicide. 2, it could be work-related. So it could be related to their work. And then she splits that into 2 further sections. 1, it's related to an actual call or event they went on, which caused that initial impairment, or it could be from a non-trauma informed or toxic work environment. Now, if you think of that, if she can do that and say this police officer died because of a toxic work environment, then that organization should be liable for that line of duty death or that workplace fatality. And the same could be said for firefighters and paramedics and dispatchers. If it is found that through an investigation that a firefighter died because of a toxic work environment, well, then that organization should be investigated and changes should be made to prevent further deaths. Yet that isn't happening. And based on the thousands now of emergency workers that I talk to and I ask about what their stresses are, the majority of them say it's not from the calls we go on, it's from the toxic work environments that they're in.
Yes, sir.
Which is a controllable environment. So if we can control those environments, then we can prevent death by suicide for emergency workers.
Absolutely. I agree with that completely. It concerns me when I go full circle back to what we spoke about a few minutes ago when I say, all right, so let's look at the others in the workplace. We look at managers, we look at upper management, we look at colleagues, we look at peers, and we say, all right, why is it that this person is bullying, is harassing, is whatever? And it comes down to your thinking. I think this individual is struggling and has no idea, or is refusing to get help, or whatever reason. But I believe it has to get so much more grassroots and rudimentary for the toxicity to change. Like, it needs to really start in the beginning. And I mean, at least in the RCMP, it's not there. I was never trained on that. I was never trained on toxicity. I was never trained on the traumas that I would face. You knew how to deal with things. And when I say deal with things, I mean investigate them, but not in terms of handling them mentally. And so I believe the toxicity is, here you go, here's something. The toxicity is being fed by the toxicity, oddly enough. When I say that as well, I look at a painting of yours, and this one is something else. It talks about being a tragic optimist or a toxic positivity. You got an RCMP officer who's coming around a barn or a Quonset, his pistol's drawn, he's in the low ready, but around the corner with a back to the wall, very peaceful, standing there by a sawhorse, is the Grim Reaper. And when you talk about this, again, you talk about the difference between being tragically optimistic or toxic positivity. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I did an art piece, and I start off actually with it in my presentation of this big cherry blossom tree when I speak about being tragically optimistic, which is really being authentic and acknowledging what's happening so you can acknowledge it and then treat it. There's this cherry blossom tree, and there's this bulldog underneath. The bulldog is me. He's half asleep while he's sitting there. There's nature, there's bumblebees, there's fairies in the trees. It's very peaceful. First glance, it's very beautiful looking image. And there's a lemur there, kind of in the periphery a little bit, and the lemur is meant to be my protector. And he can see in the far distance, in the bottom left, there's a silhouette of a man hanging on a noose, which represents suicide, which is what my danger was. So when you look at it, it's a beautiful picture, but there's still tragedy in it. Yet overall, it's optimistic because it's such a beautiful image. And that's my idea of being tragically optimistic. And that's kind of the whole focus of my presentation is, okay, I'm going to talk about suicide. I'm going to talk about, anxiety, depression, some really deep subjects. But overall, it's meant to be optimistic. Overall, it's about post-traumatic growth. But in order for me to get there, I need to acknowledge these things. I need to, okay, yes, this is what happened. Yes, I was suicidal. Yes, these are the feelings that I had, in order for me to correct them or to come up with methods to change those emotions. Otherwise, if I just keep telling myself I'm okay, and tomorrow's going to get better, which is what a toxic positivist would do, which is what I was like for many, many years, then eventually that toxicity is going to surface whether you want it or not. And it's going to bubble over in physical manifestations. In my case, I was having numbness in my body, my memory changed. So there's lots of physical manifestations that trauma will start presenting if you don't face them and deal with them yourself. So yeah, I think it's another message that I try to portray in my artwork. And I don't want to, look, here's a horrible image of death and suicide. Yeah, I was suicidal, now my life sucks, thanks for listening. That's just depressing and sad. But it's important to acknowledge those things, but at the same time, yes, this is how I was. I acknowledge how I was, but this is how I got better. And this is what happened because I did that. And I'm even better than I was. So I think it's important to acknowledge those things and to talk about suicide, because then that makes it a little bit easier for other people to talk about it as well. Being tragically optimistic is an important message. Again, I try to portray, because it was something that really resonated with me, where there's a whole field of psychology called positive psychology, which is also very important, because your thoughts, if you think positively, that will result in your emotions and your reactions and your behaviors, how that process works. So it is very important to think positively, but I think it's important to also be realistic, to be tragically optimistic is what I call that. Yeah.
I really do like that. We spoke a second ago about toxicity in the workplace. And now I'm not sure if this was the intention of this particular art piece. To me, this is what I see in it. Is you've got a firefighter who's sitting, he's holding a candle, and the candle says PTSD, the candle is lit. And you've got another firefighter who's standing next to him, pouring fuel on him. That to me is really deep. And again, that may not be what you were trying to get out of that image, but I see that happening so much in so many workplaces. What were you going for in that image, Dan? Was that what you were looking for? Or was it something completely different?
If you look closely at that one, the officer that's pouring the gasoline has a blindfold on because they don't really know the trauma that they're causing.
Right.
And the idea of that picture, and I got so much backlash from people when I shared that from leadership. And LinkedIn, when I share stuff on LinkedIn, that's kind of where all the movers and shakers are. A lot of leaders are there. I shared that. Holy smokes. I've lost so many followers on LinkedIn after I posted that, which was totally fine because,
Absolutely.
I am authentic when I share the artwork and I have to be real about it. But the idea of that is the concept of sanctuary trauma. And what sanctuary trauma is, it was first coined in the Vietnam War where veterans were coming back that were traumatized and they were hoping to be supported in their environment, but they just received more trauma. And I see that a lot in emergency workers and the people that I've talked to in my own experiences, where we'll go out on a call, it's a traumatic call, and we come back to the station, and then we would just receive more trauma, like we're not supported. And that sanctuary trauma, that secondary trauma, can actually be more significant than the primary trauma. And it is something that can be controlled, like it is a controllable stressor in the workplace. And the reason why that officer is blindfolded, because they don't know. And a lot of organizations just don't know how to control that. It's not like they're trying to be that way. They just don't know any better. So they really need help on, like, this is how you can build a psychologically healthy work environment because they're doing what they think is best. So like, okay, well, let's do a mental health weekend that everyone has to do once a year. And then we'll check that box off as, yep, we're doing something to support the mental health. Or let's start a peer support team so that when something happens, they're there to respond to it. But that really isn't a true paradigm shift for mental wellness. That's really not changing the culture of the workplace. That's going to really ingrain mental well-being in the workplace. And that's a hard thing to do. Officers and leadership, they have a ton of stuff on their plate. They have a ton of things that they have to do. They're under a lot of pressure from the cities and that they work for, or the owners of the organizations. So it's really difficult for them. And I think that they really need the help. And that's why that officer is blindfolded. But that sanctuary trauma could be a better predictor of long-term disability and permanent disability than the initial trauma. Yeah, it's a scary thing, and it happens to a lot of us. And the secondary trauma, that sanctuary trauma, isn't only in the workplace. It could be at home. It could be not getting supported from your family or your friends' circles or your coworkers. So that sanctuary trauma comes in many different forms, not only from leadership.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
I have no issue saying that sanctuary trauma is something that has hit me hard. And again, despite all the things I've seen, I think that is ultimately the straw that broke the camel's back. It's difficult. It's especially when ultimately, let's be honest, we work in a job where there's not a whole lot of benefits in terms of there's no bonuses, there's no 50% off whenever you buy in the store, any shit like that. And so you certainly expect that you will be tight knit and you will take care of each other and you will have each other's back. It is quite discouraging when something else happens and that's not the case. And that to me is very much what you're capturing in that image, which is, I believe, is beautiful. And once again, I believe if you've had people that decided to leave on LinkedIn, it's because you struck a nerve. And it's a reality. And furthermore, not that you need to hear this because you really don't, but I'm going to say it regardless. Furthermore, these are your images. This is your purging. You're the artist. You're not doing this to try to make everyone happy because ultimately the memories are not happy. I mean, the images are not thrilling, but yet you are managing to put signs of hope in there as well, which is absolutely true. So, Daniel, I think you're hitting home runs with these. And again, each one that, upset someone might be because you got a little bit closer to actually figuring this out than people are comfortable with at this point.
Yeah, and that's totally fine. Like, I have no I don't expect everyone to get my artwork. And I welcome people that, stop following me. Like if my images don't connect with you or you're offended by them, then don't follow my social media. I'm not trying to force my artwork on anybody. My mom doesn't really understand what the ideas of my artwork. I'll create something and she'll phone me. She goes, Daniel, what's with the picture you just posted? Why is it so nasty? Why is it so like gory? She doesn't understand. She goes, why would anybody want to buy that? I'm like, I don't do this for people to. Sometimes I'm surprised at some of the stuff that people buy on my website. I'm like, no, mom, that's not why I created it. Like, this is a personal purging for me. It's a personal process for me. And I've learned that other people will look at my artwork and attach their own experiences, and it will help them purge that emotion as well. And that's why I share them, is that I get almost daily, I get messages from peers commenting on the artwork and how much it has helped them because it made them feel that they're understood and that they're not alone in how they're feeling. So it helps me purge these feelings that I have, but it's also, I'm motivated at the same time because I'm able to help my peers as well. And for those people, yes, absolutely follow me and the work that I do. But for people that, maybe aren't in that situation or aren't affected by the trauma that they experience, which is, again, is normal, I think. That doesn't mean that something's wrong with you if you're not affected by the things you see. Then that's fine too. I don't think it should be forced on everybody because it may not affect everybody. So it's okay.
I look at this and I kind of think, if you don't understand it, you are a lucky person. That's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Right? That's a win that you don't understand. However, I mean, let's be honest, you have a lot of people following you, do a lot of speaking engagements because there's a lot of people who understand what it is you're saying. And I love that you're willing to push things and you have no issue saying things like, I believe I'm going to open a can of worms on this one. One of which is this painting where you've got a police officer literally bending over backwards and it says public will.
Man, you were pulling stuff out of the shadows, these images that you found. Yeah, these are images that a lot of people haven't even seen. Yeah, and that picture, because I've spoken to a lot of law enforcement officers, and so here's an example. And I worked for a city for a long time. And when I was on the engine, we would go to the grocery store to get groceries to make dinner. And we would park in the fire lane. And often there would be other people parked in the fire lane. But we weren't there for an active fire, but we would park there. People complained that the fire truck was parked in the fire lane. So we were told by the city that we weren't allowed to park in the fire lane anymore because people were complaining and I'm like, what is going on? Like, why didn't whoever phoned that complaint in, why didn't whoever answered that call say, it's the fire truck, they can park in the fire lane. It's not meant for you to park there. And they were complaining because they like to park there. So they had the balls to complain to the city that the fire truck, I couldn't believe it. Like that alone blew my mind. But the other thing that blew, and that we were told we couldn't park there anymore. I'm like, what? Like that is just mind boggling. But of course, that's coming from people that are looking to get reelected, right? So they don't want to piss off the public.
Right.
So that was kind of the idea of that. And I hear that a lot from law enforcement, of bending to the will of the public to the point where it's negatively affecting their ability to do their job. That's great that you pulled that one up. Because when I posted that one didn't get any traction at all. Like no one really commented on it. Yeah, that didn't really go anywhere, which really surprised me because a lot of people I talked to really connected with that concept, as did I, which is why I created it.
I'm surprised at some of these. I don't know. Maybe I'm seeing different things in them. I like the fact that you're not shy to hit on some things that aren't necessarily popular. However, they're real. And that's the important thing. And when it comes down to public will, ultimately, people in the emergency services are constantly judged by a group of the general populace that have not seen what we've seen, know what we know, smelled what we smelled, and Jesus, it's the smells, Daniel, that get me.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, again, there's almost this, believed inherent right that they can state how things need to be done. And that's a difficult pill for me to swallow. One of the last ones I want to make sure we hit on, because I love this as a personal one for mine. It's called The Stand, and it's how you feel about cognitive processing therapy. and you've got an individual sitting and another individual sitting, and obviously there's a therapy session happening here, but you've got a demon behind one and an angel behind another. Could you tell us about that one?
Yeah, so cognitive processing therapy, talk therapy, is similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, but cognitive processing therapy is specific to trauma. So cognitive behavioral therapy is that the therapist is going to kind of unpack or kind of get into the thought processes and the behaviors and how the thoughts result in the behaviors that you have by really getting into the thoughts that you're having. And if you can really get into and understand the thoughts that you're having and recognize if they are rational or irrational, that could really change your behavior or what is happening with this thought process. So cognitive processing therapy is more specific to the traumatic experiences that you have, really kind of getting into that and really processing it is how it is. So that is really kind of opening the door where this is happening. So the idea of that picture is where the therapist has the angel, which is recovery, behind her, and I can't remember, I think it was a police officer, or I think it was just a first responder, just normal clothes, I think, that is having that conversation, trying to really look behind the curtain, and the trauma is getting mad because hey, you're exposing me, is kind of the idea. Through cognitive processing, you're really exposing the trauma and being forced to look at it. It's like, yeah, I see you. We're going to acknowledge you, and we are going to figure out what you're doing versus just letting you run amok in the sidelines and do this kind of automatically, which is what happened for me. So that was kind of the idea of that. And eventually, yeah, I kind of felt like it's a hard process. It wasn't easy for me because I really was forced to really acknowledge what was going on. And it was uncomfortable. But for me, that was one of the modalities that really helped me process the traumas that I had experienced. But I kind of felt like that way, where it was like a battle between the trauma and the recovery during that process.
Do you feel you've shed that demon, or do you feel you at least have demised the strength of it?
Overall, 100% yes. But there are still emotions and feelings I need to process. And, I'm not on the ambulance anymore, or the project anymore, so I'm not being exposed to new traumas. But I have 20 years of experiences that are still bubbling up that I need to purge and process. But yeah, it's definitely, if I think of all the traumas I've had as a bucket, where it got so full it was spilling over and impeding my function, all the functions that I have in my world, then yeah, that bucket is definitely a lot easier to manage, but I wouldn't say it's empty.
No.
I don't know if it'd ever be empty, because there's other things that a lot of people, it's not just from the traumas of their jobs. There's a lot of childhood stuff that a lot of people have that will fill that bucket as well. And so there's a lot of experiences that I need to process. But the idea is that I did punch some holes in that bucket and the water is emptying out, which is good.
That's awesome. I like that analogy as well. Dan, the last question I want to ask before we sum things up is, to me, you epitomize the concept of post-traumatic growth. And what I want, if possible, you to share for those who can't understand it, can't wrap their heads around it, can't think that day ever exists. Is there keys? Is there certain things they ought to be looking at or considering? How is it that one can start on the path of realizing post-traumatic growth?
Well, I think the first step, the goal shouldn't be post-traumatic growth. For me, post-traumatic growth was something that happened that I really wasn't aware. I think it's too daunting to go from I'm suicidal, I'm having suicidal ideation, to the idea of post-traumatic growth. That, I think, is, in my opinion, too much to ask for somebody.
That is definitely the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, right. Like if you start thinking that right away, like, oh, I'll never get there. I'm thinking of killing myself today. How am I supposed to think about being a superhero, restructuring my brain to become better than I am? That's not thought process or the brain chemistry that person has at that time. So the first step, again, for me, I'm not going to tell people what to do, but for me, it was discovering that I had that injury. Because me, I didn't even know, because my trauma wasn't that one event. It was several events where these symptoms came up that I didn't understand were because of my work. I didn't know that I had an injury. So discovering I have the injury, being diagnosed by a professional, and I don't mean Dr. Google, but I do recommend people, if they do feel like they're having symptoms, you can do an online self-assessment, but many of those assessments will, like here in Canada, we have the SIPSTRIP one, which is great. And based on that, it will give you suggestions on what you can do But I always recommend to seek help from a mental health professional, psychologist, psychiatrist, someone that has experience in mental injuries with emergency workers, and get a proper diagnosis. So for me, my process went from I was suicidal, I didn't know because my brain chemistry, I didn't have the capacity to know that there was even anything wrong with me, to someone showing me, hey, Dan, being suicidal isn't a normal everyday process. So I thought, oh, okay, maybe I should get checked. And I got checked, got diagnosed with Dan, you got PTSD. I'm like, holy crap, I had no idea. But now that I have that diagnosis, then there's treatments that can be done. Right. So with that treatment, even that part could be hard because people's treatment could be a little bit different, what's going to work for them. But for me, it was cognitive processing therapy and creating the artwork. And then that was kind of my path to getting back to my normal and actually going beyond into the post-traumatic growth. So it's not suicide ideation, next step, post-traumatic growth. There's many steps in between that have to happen. And it's a long, hard process. It was for me. But overall, well, it saved my life. So my recommendation for anybody, if you feel like you're having any of these symptoms, to get, if you have the means, get assessed by a mental health professional. Maybe it's just burnout. Burnout and post-traumatic stress is very similar, and there's different treatments for both. So get help from someone that is trained in dealing with these types of situations for people. And that would be my recommendation first. And then hopefully you'll reach that post-traumatic growth phase through that process.
Perfect. People want to get information on your peer recovery and resiliency symposium. They go to dansunsymposium.com. Is that correct?
Yes. And I only have 12 seats left.
Wow.
As of this morning. So depending on when this airs, we may be sold out potentially.
Okay.
But yeah, if you go there, you can get some tickets. But yeah, I have some amazing friends coming to speak on their experiences of post-traumatic growth, including a paramedic that was at 9/11 in New York, that was working as the towers fell, and another paramedic that was in Las Vegas during the shooting there on October 1st. A friend of mine from Australia is coming, who's going to share some stories on, she's a vascular paramedic, critical care paramedic, and a neuroscientist. She's going to share her experiences with childhood trauma and trauma experienced on the job, and other speakers that have incredible stories of post-traumatic growth, and they're all our peers.
Fantastic. Daniel, I know you are an extremely busy man, and I am so very grateful that you've made time today to talk with me and for all those listening. Before we end off, is there anything else that you would like to say? Anything you would add? The floor is completely open.
No, I think I said a lot in this podcast, which is great. I appreciate the platform to do that. But I think the big message is, for me, I really didn't know what was happening to me. And again, because my brain chemistry was changed and my neural pathways were altered, I lost the capacity to even recognize what was happening to me. So the first message would be, if you do feel that you're having anything, ask for help. For me, I thought tomorrow it would just get better the next day, and it just never did for me. But get assessed. That nothing wrong with getting a physical checkup every year, every couple of years. So you could do the same for a mental health checkup. And the other side of that is, if you recognize changes in behavior, or if you suspect that from a coworker or a friend or a family member, then I would call them on it. I would say, hey, I'm just checking in to see how you're doing. More than likely, they're going to say, yeah, I'm fine. But then say, well, the reason I'm asking is because of these specific things. I've noticed these changes in your behavior, and I'm just worried about you. I just want to make sure that you're okay, and if there's anything I can do to help. Sometimes that takes a lot of balls to do that. But some of us need someone to reach in to that shell of trauma to help pull us out, or at least let them make us aware that, look, I've got your back. It's okay. I'm here for you. So that would be a couple messages that I would condone.
Awesome. Thank you again, Dan. I really appreciate your time. For everyone out there, go to Dan Sun Photo Art. Take a look at the images. I am absolutely positive, if you're listening to this podcast, there are images in here that will resonate with you, and that will, in a lot of ways, help explain some of the things that are going on in your mind. And I don't mean explain to you per se. I mean it becomes able to explain to others who don't understand. The lucky ones, but family members, your spouse, your partner, your peers, your coworkers. Take a look and at least be able to say this right here is the one that I feel. This is what I'm experiencing. This is what I'm concerned about. This is what keeps repeating in my mind. That alone can start a very important conversation. My name is Larry Payton. I have your 6. Please have more.
don't go away. There's so much left to do, so many things I wanna say, and I say, don't make the change. If it rains every single day, I'll fight to blow it all away.